That night, I heard gunshots right outside my door. The entire neighborhood sank into deadly silence, while my heart pounded like it was about to explode. I was just an ordinary dad, who had never held a weapon, never thought I'd have to face death. But in just a few seconds, I ran outside like a madman. And that very moment turned my whole life into a movie that even Hollywood wouldn't dare to script. Because just a few hours later, a powerful CEO, famous for being cold and untouchable, knelt down in front of me and cried like a child. No one could believe it. I couldn't believe it either. But it was all real. And this is the story of how an unknown father became a hero overnight. Subscribe now so you won't miss the next part of this story. I never thought my name would ever be mentioned on the evening news. Because for so many years, I was just an ordinary dad, doing a dull job, leaving with my briefcase in the morning and returning quietly at night. No one ever looked at me twice when I walked down the street. I had no money, no power, not even a single achievement worth remembering. But that very invisibility turned me into someone no one could have imagined on that night filled with gunfire. I was born into a poor family, raised on leftover rice and plain water instead of proper meals. You might ask, how could someone like me possibly stand up to armed criminals? And you'd be right, I used to ask myself the very same question. But sometimes, life doesn't give you a choice. It throws you into a life or death situation, and in a single heartbeat, you either stand up or disappear from this world. All my life, I had never been a hero. But that night, everything changed. Not because I wanted fame, and not because I wanted to prove anything. But because, in that moment, I realized, if I didn't act, I would live forever in regret. Have you ever asked yourself what could make an ordinary person step right into the line between life and death? I found the answer. And that was the beginning of a night that would make even the most powerful CEO break down in tears before me. That day began just like any other. I woke up at 6 a.m., brewed a cup of coffee so weak no one would want to drink it, then quietly got ready for work. My daughter sat at the table, eating breakfast while grumbling about her math homework. My wife was busy bustling around in the kitchen, and I could only smile faintly. No one in my family had the slightest idea that night would change everything. My job wasn't anything special either. I worked at an old warehouse, spending my days hauling boxes, scribbling in ledgers, and sweating through my shirt. Can you believe that a lowly warehouse worker like me would soon become the man who made the most powerful CEO break down in tears? Sounds insane, doesn't it? And yet, sometimes it's the monotony that sets the stage for moments that leave the whole world in shock. That afternoon, the sky suddenly opened up and rain poured down. My family huddled together in our small home, sharing a simple dinner of vegetable soup and leftover rice. We laughed and chatted while the TV hummed in the background, and I still remember the sparkle in my daughter's eyes as she told stories from school. None of us knew that just a few hours later, laughter would turn into screams. The clinking of spoons against bowls would be drowned out by the crack of gunfire. And our familiar peace would be shattered in an instant. Have you ever lived through a moment that felt completely ordinary, only to suddenly twist into a nightmare? I did. And that was the beginning of a story no one would believe. The first explosion tore through the night like it was ripping the sky apart. I jolted so hard that the spoon slipped right out of my hand. My daughter screamed, my wife clutched her tightly, trembling, and for a few seconds I was frozen in place. But then my heart started pounding so violently it felt like someone was crushing my chest. I knew instantly, this wasn't fireworks. That was gunfire. The whole neighborhood was swallowed by chaos. Glass shattering, tires screeching, desperate cries for help echoing through the darkness. Have you ever heard gunshots right outside your own front door? It's nothing like the movies. It's so real it freezes the blood in your veins. My wife grabbed my arm and screamed, "Don't go out there." But something inside my head had already risen above fear. I couldn't just sit still. I couldn't watch my family shrink into a corner while someone out there was begging for their life. And in one reckless instant, I shot up, threw open the door, and rushed outside like it was the last breath I'd ever take. The door slammed shut behind me, and the world outside looked like a war zone. Streetlights flickered, shadows darted, and right in front of me stood a group of men gripping guns in their hands. What do you think a man like me, an ordinary father, could possibly do in that moment? Run? Or fight back? I chose a path that even I still can't believe. I stood in the middle of the pitch-dark street, facing 4 men with guns, their eyes cold and predatory. My whole body was trembling, but my feet refused to step back. Behind them, I saw a young man tied up, blood dripping from his forehead, his mouth desperately screaming for help. Have you ever been in a moment where one step back meant safety, but one step forward could cost you your life? That's exactly where I was. Without thinking twice, I grabbed a broken brick from the ground. My heart was hammering out of my chest, and I charged at them like a madman. Gunfire erupted, a bullet whizzed past my ear, scorching hot like fire. I hurled the brick at the one closest to me and lunged forward, grappling with him. Everything happened in seconds, chaotic, breathless, unreal. The man who was tied up looked at me with eyes full of despair and a flicker of hope. I screamed, cutting him loose, while I was shoved down hard against the cold concrete. Do you think an untrained man, with no weapon, could take on an armed gang? The answer is, no. But sometimes, just being a reckless lunatic is enough to change everything. Then came the wail of police sirens. The gang panicked and fled, leaving me gasping for air in a pool of blood and gun smoke. The young man fell to his knees, gripped my hand tight, and whispered, "You just saved my life." And I had no idea that moment would open a door I never dared to dream of. If you want to know what happened next, hit subscribe right now so you don't miss it. I collapsed onto the pavement, my hands trembling from both pain and shock. The blaring sirens pierced the night, red and blue lights flashing across my face, making everything feel like a living nightmare. My whole body was frozen, and the stench of gunpowder still burned in my throat. Have you ever felt like you just stepped out of an action movie, except you were the main character? That's exactly how I lived that night. The gunmen were taken down, some pinned to the ground by officers, others knocked out cold from my reckless blows. The young man I had freed was whisked away, his face pale with terror. He glanced back at me, eyes bloodshot, as if he wanted to say something, but didn't. I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. All I knew was that my heart was racing, my head spinning, and the whole neighborhood was buzzing like a hive in chaos. Neighbors poured into the street, staring at me with strange eyes. Some were horrified. Some were stunned. And a few looked at me like I was nothing more than a lunatic who had gambled with death. What do you think, if an ordinary man suddenly stood in the middle of gunfire like a hero, would people cheer, or whisper that he was a fool? I dragged myself home. My wife burst into tears when she saw me covered in blood. My daughter clung to my leg, shaking, her voice breaking as she asked, "Daddy, are you going to die?" That question cut through me like a blade. I didn't die. But from that moment on, I knew, I would never be just an ordinary man again. The next morning, I was still lying in bed, sore and bruised, thinking everything was finally over. But then, a strange sound echoed outside my front door. When I stepped out, I froze. A sleek black luxury car, the kind I had never even dared to dream of touching, was parked right in front of my yard. And when the door opened, the man who stepped out made my entire neighborhood fall silent. It was a man in a perfectly tailored suit, a face so familiar I had seen it on the covers of business magazines. Yes, it was the famous CEO everyone knew. Can you believe it? A nobody like me, a warehouse laborer, suddenly standing face to face with one of the most powerful men in the city? But the real shock hadn't even begun. He didn't shake my hand. He didn't smile. He didn't act distant or superior the way I imagined a man of his stature would. Instead, he rushed toward me, dropped to his knees right there in my yard, and broke into tears. Tears streamed down his face as his trembling hands clutched my own battered ones. The entire neighborhood went silent, no one even dared to breathe. Have you ever witnessed a billionaire CEO kneeling and weeping before a complete nobody? I stood frozen, unable to believe my eyes. Before I could even ask a single question, his voice cracked as he whispered something that struck me straight to the heart. A single sentence that would forever change the way I looked at that fateful night. He grabbed my hand, sobbing like a child. Amid the whispers and gasps of my neighbors, I only heard one sentence, one that made the blood in my veins freeze. "The man you saved last night was my son." I stood there trembling, paralyzed. I couldn't believe it. The young man tied up, crying for help in the middle of gunfire last night, he was the only son of this powerful CEO. Can you even imagine? One reckless decision in just a few seconds ended up changing the fate of an entire empire. And more than that, it changed my life forever. The CEO clutched my shoulders, tears streaming down his face, repeating over and over, "If it weren't for you, I would have lost everything." I had never seen a man of wealth, fame, and stone-cold authority crumble like that before my eyes. In that moment, I was no longer a nameless man. I had become the one holding the lifeline of an empire. It sounds insane, doesn't it? But it was the truth. What would you do if you suddenly became the savior of a billionaire? I didn't know whether to laugh, to cry, or to run away from all that attention. But in that instant, I realized something. Sometimes courage doesn't just save a life, it awakens hearts that power and money had long turned to stone. And from that very moment, my life began an entirely new chapter. After that moment, I never lived an ordinary life again. The news spread faster than wildfire. The press called me the hero of the night. Neighbors who had barely noticed me before now looked at me with a mix of admiration and curiosity. Can you believe it? In just one night, from a nameless worker, I became a headline story. But that was only the beginning. The CEO didn't stop at gratitude. He invited me to become a security advisor for his corporation, with a salary I had never dared to dream of. A man who had never set foot in a luxury office was suddenly sitting in meetings where every word spoken could move millions of dollars. Sounds like a joke, right? And yet, I was living inside that very joke. My family's life transformed too. My wife, who once cried in fear, now held her head high with pride. My daughter, no longer teased for being poor, was proudly called the hero's daughter. And I still couldn't believe I had gone from freezer rooms with calloused hands to glass-walled boardrooms gleaming with power. But think about it. Could one reckless act in a matter of seconds truly change an entire life? I proved it could. And if you want to keep hearing how I went from a nobody to the man who made a CEO weep, don't forget to hit subscribe right now. Now, as I sit here telling it all, I still can't believe my life turned upside down in just one night. From an ordinary father, I became an accidental hero. From a nameless worker, I became an advisor to a massive corporation. And from a man no one ever noticed, I suddenly became the one who made a billionaire CEO break down in tears. But the most important part wasn't the money, the fame, or the powerful handshakes. The most important part was the choice I made. I chose to step out that door, even knowing there were guns waiting. I chose to face it instead of running away. Have you ever asked yourself, if one day you were cornered, would you stand tall or collapse? I found my own answer. Maybe I'm not a hero in everyone's eyes. Maybe some think I was just a reckless fool. But for my family, and for the man who got his son back, I did the right thing. And that alone is enough to make me smile every time I remember it. This story isn't just mine. It's a reminder that sometimes, the most ordinary people create the most extraordinary moments. Do you think you'd be able to do the same? If you want to hear more thrilling, unbelievable stories like this one, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell right now.